The Mystery and Romance of Alchemy and Pharmacy. By C.J.S. Thompson. 1897. Part 1. Chapter 2. The Wizards of Early Greece. One of the earliest magicians or soothsayers of which we have record out of the era of mythology was Tiresias. He lived in the times of Oedipus and the War of the Seven Chiefs against Thebes. For having offended the gods he was visited with blindness, but being repentant, tradition states they recompensed him for this affliction by endowing him with the gift of prophecy and the act of divination. He is also said to have been able to hold communion with the feathered world, and to have power over the spirits of the dead, whom he could compel to appear and reply to his inquiries. His incantations and spells were supposed to be irresistible, and he could foretell future events by signs from fire, smoke, and other methods of divining. Abaris, a native of Scythia, was another magician of renown. There is no exact record of the time in which he lived, but he is represented by some as having constructed the Palladium which protected Troy from its enemies for a long time. Other authors declare he was a friend of Pythagoras, who flourished some 600 years later. According to Herodotus, he traveled over the world with an arrow, eating nothing during his journey. By others it is said the arrow was presented to him by Apollo, and that upon it he rode through the air, and traveled over lands, seas, mountains, and other inaccessible places. But from all accounts his repute as a magician and seer is confirmed. He is said to have foretold earthquakes, allayed storms and pestilence, cured disease by charms and incantations, and was generally revered for his power and command over the dwellers in the unseen world. Pythagoras, one of the most notable magicians in early history, was born about the year BC 586, and lived during the time of Cyrus and Darius Hystaspes, of Croesus, of Pisistratus, of Polycrates, and Amasis king of Egypt. He was renowned not only as a philosopher but as a leader and politician, and was learned in all branches of science then known. The early part of his life was spent in Egypt, but he also traveled in order to gather experience and knowledge until he reached the age of 40 years. Afterwards he founded a school, where he lectured and instructed a large number of followers who were attracted by his wisdom and learning. He divided his pupils into two classes, the neophytes, to whom were explained the elementary and general principles of his philosophy, while the advanced were admitted into his entire confidence and formed a brotherhood, who threw their property into a common stock and lived together. During the latter part of his life he is said to have lived in Magna Graecia, where he carried on his studies and made some of his great discoveries. He was a profound geometrician, and two great theorems, one still known as the Pythagorean, are ascribed to him. He propounded the doctrine that the Earth is a planet of spherical form, and the Sun the center of the planetary system. His philosophy prescribed and taught a total abstinence from everything which had animal life, and temperance in all things, together with the subjection of the appetites of the body. By this strict discipline, he seems to have obtained almost complete control over the wills and minds of his followers, from whom he demanded the utmost docility. Preparatory to entering on his novitiate, the pupil was strictly examined by the master as to his principles, habits, and intentions. The tone of his voice, his manner of speaking, his walk, gestures, and the lines of his face and the expression of his eyes, were all carefully observed, and only if all these features were satisfactory was he admitted as a probationer. After this interview the master withdrew from the sight of the pupil, who could then enter on his novitiate of 3 and 5, in all 8 years, during which time he was not permitted to look on the master, but only hear him speak from behind a curtain. And he was enjoined to preserve the strictest silence. To add to his mystery and authority, Pythagoras is said to have hid himself during the day from his pupils, and was only visible to them after the night had come on. He is described as having a most imposing and majestic appearance, with a grave and awe-inspiring countenance. When he came forth he appeared in a long garment of the purest white, with his long beard flowing, and a garland upon his head. He allowed his followers to believe he was one of the gods. And he is said to have told Abaris that he resumed human form so that he might win the confidence of man. Doubtless, owing to his great attainments and his superiority to the men of his time, he considered himself more divine than human, and he claimed to have miraculous endowments. Those who were not of his followers ascribed the stories related of him to magic, which probably, like other philosophers, he studied. Among other stories which tradition has handed down concerning Pythagoras are the following. He professed to have appeared in different ages in various human forms, first as Ethalides, the son of Mercury, and then as Euphorbus, who slew Patroclus at the siege of Troy, and as other individuals also. He is said to have tamed a bear by whispering in its ear, and prevailed on it to feed on vegetables alone. He called also an eagle down from its flight, causing it to sit on his hand as if quite tame. When Abyrus addressed him as one of the heavenly host, he convinced him that he was indeed a celestial being by showing him his thigh of gold, which also he exhibited to skeptical pupils. At another period he absented himself from his associates in Italy for a year. When he reappeared he stated he had been sojourning in the infernal regions, and gave them wonderful descriptions of the strange things he had seen there. These and many other fabulous stories are related of this singular man, which prove him to have been as wily as he was wise. One curious rule by which he bound his pupils is worth mentioning. At the end of their novitiate, if it was discovered that their intellectual faculties were too weak to grapple with the intricacies of his theories and problems, they were expelled the community. The double of the property they had contributed to the common stock was refunded to them, a monument inscribed with their names was placed in the meeting place of the community, and they were considered as dead by the brotherhood. It is easy to imagine with what feelings these measures would be regarded by some who were called to submit to them, and so they eventually proved the cause of the breakup of the Pythagorean school. Cylon, a man of great wealth of Crotona, conceived a great partiality for Pythagoras, and became a novice with Paraeolus, and submitted to all the severities of the school. They passed through the 3 years of probation and 5 years of silence, and were received into the familiarity of the master. But after they had delivered their wealth into the common stock, Pythagoras pronounced them to be deficient in intellectual power, or for some other reason most probably they were expelled. A tablet inscribed with their names was set up, and they were pronounced dead to the school. Cylon, who was a man of excitable and violent temperament, became highly incensed at this treatment, and resolved on vengeance. Collecting a band of followers, which probably included a large number of rejected students, they surrounded the school of the master and set it on fire. 40 people are said to have perished in the flames, but Pythagoras with 2 of his pupils escaped to Metapontum, where he took refuge in the temple of the Muses. The strife fomented by Cylon broke out afresh, and he was closely besieged in the temple by his enemies. The rioting continued, and as no provisions could be conveyed to him, he finally perished with hunger, according to Laertius, after 40 days' abstinence. Thus ended Pythagoras, a man of undoubted genius, and in knowledge much in advance of his time. Although his teachings were mixed up with considerable artifice and deception, he ranks as one of the greatest of the Greek philosophers. Epimenides was a native of Crete, and probably lived before the time of Pythagoras. He was credited with marvelous performances from a very early age, and is said when quite a lad to have retired to a cave and slept for 57 years. He then returned to his father's house, which he found in the possession of a new tenant, and the family disappeared. At length he came across his brother, who had grown into an old man, who after some time acknowledged him. On this story becoming known, he was accounted a favorite of the gods, and he professed to be endowed with supernatural gifts. He made it known that he was supplied with food by the nymphs, and that he was exempt from the usual necessities imposed on the body by nature. He boasted that he could separate his soul from his body and recall it as he thought fit. He professed to have dealings with the unseen world, and would exorcise evil spirits or work spells. He had great renown as a seer, and his prophecies were regarded as direct messages from the gods. But the great act of his life was his delivery of Athens from a great pestilence after the rebellion of Cylon. The plague, which had almost decimated the city, could not be stopped, and the Athenian Senate, after much deliberation, resolved to send for Epimenides, who was at that time in Crete. A special vessel was placed under the command of one of the first citizens of the state, who was commissioned to bring the wise magician. On his arrival at Athens he at once set to work with solemn rites and ceremonials. He commanded that a number of black and white sheep should be led to the Areopagus. Then be let loose and allowed to wander whither they wished. Certain persons were instructed to follow them and mark the spot where they lay down, on which place the animal was sacrificed to the local deity. In this manner, it is recorded, the plague was stayed. According to some writers he also sacrificed human victims. Although pressed by the Athenian Senate to take a recompense for his services, Epimenides is said to have refused all gifts, stipulating only that there should be perpetual peace between the Athenians and the people of Knossos, his native city. He died shortly afterwards, at the reputed age of 157 years. Empedocles was a distinguished magician, orator, and poet, and was born in Agrigentum, Sicily. He was a follower of Pythagoras, and probably received instruction from his successors. He was credited with miraculous powers, and to have been able to restore the dead to life. He was skilled in medicine and the use of herbs, and was indeed a general benefactor to the citizens of his native place, where he was almost worshipped as a god. Like other philosophers of his time, he was inordinately vain, but was undoubtedly a man of great intelligence, and conferred immense benefits on his fellow creatures. His belief in the power of magic is shown in the following words he was wont to address to his students: "By my instructions you shall learn medicines that are powerful to cure disease and reanimate old age, you shall be able to calm the savage winds which lay waste the labors of all the husbandmen, and, when you will, shall send forth the tempest again, you shall cause the skies to be fair and serene, or, once more, shall draw down refreshing showers, reanimating the fruits of the earth. Nay, you shall recall the strength of the dead man when he has already become the victim of Pluto." Of himself he said, "I mix with you a god, no longer a mortal, and am everywhere honored by you, as is just, crowned with fillets and fragrant garlands, adorned with which, when I visit populous cities, I am revered by both men and women, who follow me by 10,000s, inquiring the road to boundless wealth, seeking the gift of prophecy, and who would learn the marvelous skill to cure all kinds of diseases." Of other wizards of early Greece, Herodotus mentions Aristras, a poet of Proconnesus, who is said to have mysteriously disappeared from the earth for 340 years, and then appeared again at Metapontum and commanded the citizens to erect a statue to him. Also Hermodamus, who was reputed to have the power of separating his soul from his body at will. But little is known beyond the merest tradition of these worthies. Chapter 3. The Wizards of the Roman Empire. The Roman philosophers, like the Greeks, claimed to possess occult powers, and the practitioners of magic and sorcery were numerous during the time of the empire. We have a graphic description of the incantations of a Roman sorceress in the story of Dido. Deserted by Aeneas, she resolves on self-destruction. To delude her sister as to her secret purpose she sends for a priestess from the gardens of the Hesperides, pretending that her object is to effect the return of her lover by means of certain magical incantations. The priestess, who is invested with magical powers, can call up the spirits of the dead, cause the solid earth to rock and quake, and the trees of the forest to descend from the mountains. On the arrival of the sorceress, she commands that a funeral pyre shall be erected in the interior court of the palace, and that the arms of Aeneas, what remains of his attire, and the marriage bed in which Dido had received him, shall be placed upon it. The pyre is to be hung round with garlands and branches of cypress, and the whole crowned with a picture of Aeneas and his sword. Altars were placed around, and the priestess, with dishevelled hair, cried aloud with terrible charms upon her 300 gods, upon Erebus, Chaos, and the three-faced Hecate. The waters of Avernus were then sprinkled about, and certain magical herbs that had been cut by moonlight with a sickle of brass. The priestess had with her the excrescence which is found upon the forehead of a new-cast foal, of the size of a dried fig, a talisman of great power. Dido is then called upon to approach, and, with her robe drawn up exposing one bare foot, she makes the circle of the altars, embracing them successively, and breaks over each a consecrated cake. The pyre is lit, and the charm is supposed to be complete. But all the power and the elaborate ritual prescribed by the sorceress were of no avail. Aeneas returns not, and the broken-hearted Dido finally stabs herself and dies. Many prodigies are interspersed throughout the early history of Rome, and most of the acts of these people were surrounded with a halo of superstition natural at the time, and doubtless largely exaggerated. Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and Lucan all allude to the belief in and the practice of sorcery and magic by the Romans. In the 8th Eclogue of Virgil we have a detailed description of a Roman sorceress. She is introduced by the poet as giving directions to her assistant as to the working of certain charms. Her object, a common one apparently at that time, is to recall Daphnis, whom she calls her husband, to return once more to her arms. The assistant is directed to burn vervain and frankincense, and the highest efficacy is ascribed to a solemn chant, which is capable of calling down the moon from its sphere or making the cold-blooded snake burst in the field. And was the means by which Circe turned the companions of Ulysses into beasts. The image of Daphnis is then ordered to be thrice bound round with fillets of 3 colors, the assistant at the same time repeating the words, "Thus I bind the fillets of Venus," and then paraded about a prepared altar. An image of clay and one of wax are placed before the same fire, and as the image of clay hardens, so does the heart of Daphnis harden towards his new mistress, and as the figure of wax softens, so is the heart of the ex-lover made tender towards the sorceress. A sacred cake is then broken over the image, and crackling laurels burnt before it. She prays that as the wanton heifer pursues the steer through woods and glens till at length, worn out with fatigue, she lies down on the oozy reeds by the banks of the stream, and the night dew will not even drive her away, so Daphnis may be led on after her forever with inextinguishable love. The relics of his belongings are then buried beneath the threshold. She bruises poisonous herbs of resistless virtue, which had been gathered in the kingdom of Pontus, herbs which enabled him who gave them to turn himself into a hungry wolf prowling amidst the forests, to call up ghosts from the grave, and to translate the ripened harvest from the field where it grew to the lands of another. The ashes of these herbs are cast over her head into the running stream, while she must not look behind her. At length the sorceress begins to despair and cries, "Daphnis heeds not my incantations, heeds not the gods." She looks again, and perceives the ashes on the altar are glowing and emitting sparks of fire. Her faithful house dog barks before the door. "Can these things be," she exclaims, "or do lovers dream what they desire? It is not so. The real Daphnis comes, I hear his steps, he has left the deluding town, he hastens to my longing arms." In the works of Horace an interesting description of a witch's incantation is also given, the details of which it is instructive to compare with those given by other writers. For sorceresses are assembled in conclave, the chief being Canidia, with 3 assistants, in order to work a charm by means of which a youth named Varus, for whom Canidia had conceived a passion, may be compelled to reciprocate her affections. Canidia, with the locks of her disheveled hair twined round with venomous and deadly serpents, orders the wild fig tree and the funeral cypress to be rooted up from the sepulchres on which they grew. And these, together with the egg of a toad smeared with blood, the plumage of the screech owl, various herbs brought from Thessaly in Georgia, and bones torn from the jaws of a famished dog, to be burnt in flames fed with perfumes from Colchis. One assistant, whose hair stands stiff and erect like the quills of the sea hedgehog or the bristles of a hunted boar, sprinkles the ground with drops from the Avernus, while another, who is reputed to have had the faculty of conjuring the stars and moon down from heaven, assists in other ways. The fourth witch is busy digging a hole with a spade, in which is to be plunged up to his chin the beardless youth stripped of his purple robe, the emblem of his noble descent, and naked, that from his marrow, already dry, and his liver, when at length his eyeballs, long fixed on the still renovated food which is withheld from his famished jaws, have no longer the power to discern, may be concreted the love potion from which the witches promise themselves the most wonderful results. Canidia, unmoved by his sufferings, works herself into a great rage, and calls upon the night and the morn to help in her infamous incantation. But her victim manages to evade destruction by means of some magical antidote. She then resolves to prepare a still more powerful charm, exclaiming, sooner shall the sky be swallowed up in the sea and the earth be stretched a covering over both, than thou, my enemy, shalt not be wrapped in the flames of love as subtle and tenacious as those of burning pitch. Thus ends chapters 2 and 3, in part 1 of the mystery and romance of alchemy and pharmacy. Coming up is part 1, chapters 4 and 5, the fathers of medicine and the early age of Greek and Roman pharmacy. I hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to subscribe to be notified when new releases are available.